Hello, I'm Patrick Christie's.
And I'm Mercy Moroki.
Make sure that you join us Monday to Thursday, 10 a.m. until midday, right here on GB News for To The Point.
We're not afraid to talk about the topics that matter to you or the big topics that always matter.
We cover absolutely everything, from the breaking political stories of the day to law and order, what's going on in the channel. We're not afraid to hold people to account.
We always make sure we include your views on our show.
Indeed, if you're thinking it, you can guarantee that we're saying it. So make sure you join the conversation with us, 10 a.m. until midday, Monday to Thursday, for To The Point on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hello and welcome to We Need to Talk About on GB News with me, Alex Phillips, where I get stuck into the big issues that, frankly, we need to be looking at in depth. Nothing is off the table and no one's going to get cancelled for saying exactly what they think. Keeping me company today is Benjamin Loughnane from the Conservative think tank The Bow Group, and here's what we're discussing today on the show. So, as Russian missiles continue to brutalise Ukraine, there are reports that those weapons were most likely to have been bought from Germany and France. How did that happen when there was an EU ban on selling arms to Russia? Plus, more on the government's grand plan to send migrants to Rwanda. Now there are claims that just 2% will be planed out to the African nation. In this hour, we expect to hear from the Home Secretary on her immigration policy. And Westminster. More than 1 in 7 MPs are currently under investigation for sexual harassment. Is it time politics had its very own Me Too movement? That's what we're talking about for the next hour. What do you need to get off your chest? Email me, gbviews@gbnews.uk, or you can tweet me at gbnews. But first, it's time for the GB News headlines with Rosie.
Good afternoon, it's 2 minutes past 2. I'm Rosie Wright, keeping you up to date. Police have arrested a man on suspicion of murder after 4 people were stabbed to death in south-east London. The bodies of 3 women and a man were found in Bermondsey in the early hours of this morning. It's believed the arrested man knew the victims. Neighbours say they were woken by the police response.
It's devastating. The thing is, there's a primary school up that end, there's a primary school, secondary school round the corner, and most of the, families around here, we've got young children. Now, even parents, you can't even look over your own shoulder and go out. People are scared. I'm scared.
Local MP Harriet Harman, who was at the scene, described it as a terrible tragedy.
Nobody expects this sort of, deaths on this scale to be happening anywhere, but let alone in this sort of neighbourhood. I know that the police have already arrested somebody, but I think that the important thing is that anybody who's got any information to give it to the police.
The press regulator has received 5,500 complaints over an article about the deputy Labour leader. The Mail on Sunday, they reported claims by an unnamed Conservative MP that Angela Rayner tried to distract the Prime Minister in the Commons by crossing and uncrossing her legs. Ipsos is looking into possible breaches of the editorial code in the article. The Prime Minister says it's unacceptable.
I thought it was the most appalling load of sexist, misogynist tripe, and I immediately got in touch with Angela, and we had a very friendly exchange. And if we ever find who was responsible for it, I don't know what we'll do with them, but we'll be the terrors of the earth. But it's totally intolerable, that kind of thing.
Ukraine is asking the United Nations to act as an initiator and a guarantor of any humanitarian corridor put in place from the steel plant in Mariupol, where there's still more than 1,000 people sheltering. Casualties are also being reported after 5 railway stations came under fire, including one on the outskirts of Lviv. Washington has announced a further £500 million worth of aid as the US Secretary of State and the Defence Secretary travelled to Kyiv, the first official US visit to Ukraine since Russia invaded. Blinken says there's evidence the battle for the capital has been won and that the US will decide carefully when to reopen its embassy.
part of our commitment going forward involves a number of things that I was able to share with President Zelensky yesterday, including the return of American diplomats to Ukraine starting next week, including President Biden's intent to nominate a new ambassador to Ukraine, Ambassador Bridget Brink, currently an ambassador, someone I've served with for a long time, deeply experienced in the region, will be a very strong representative for the United States in Ukraine.
Boris Johnson says it's very important to have a French president who can be relied upon over the war in Ukraine. It's after Emmanuel Macron beat his right-wing opponent Marine Le Pen in the presidential elections. Miss Le Pen had previously had close ties with Vladimir Putin. Macron took 58% of the vote to secure a second term in office, the first French president to do so in 20 years. The average asking price for a home across Britain has risen by more than £19,000 in the last 3 months. It's the biggest quarterly jump ever recorded by Rightmove. Properties went on the market for an average of £360,000 in April, with more than half selling at or above the asking price. The Duke and Duchess of Cambridge have attended a service at Westminster Abbey to commemorate Anzac Day. Earlier, Prince William laid a wreath at the cenotaph to remember the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps personnel who were killed during a battle in Gallipoli during the First World War. 1,300 lives were lost. Anzac Day originally commemorated the ill-fated Allied landings, but now it honours troops from all conflicts. You're up to date on GB News. I'll bring you more as it happens. Now let's head back to Alex.
A shocking report in The Telegraph this weekend revealed the extent to which EU countries allegedly broke EU sanctions to sell weapons to Russia. Over €350 million of equipment likely being used to bombard Ukraine, with thousands of innocent civilians slaughtered and millions displaced. And it wasn't just so-called dual-use exports or materials which could be used to make arms. No. They sold bombs, rockets, missiles and guns, despite an EU-wide ban after Russia annexed Crimea in 2014. The EU has now been forced to plug a loophole exploited to sell hardware to the Kremlin under the guise it was laughably meant for civilian purposes, with Germany and France accounting for 78% of those exports. And the dates of these dodgy deals? 2015 to 2020. Now, why is that significant? One Emmanuel Macron became French president in 2017 and has just spent most of his campaign lambasting Le Pen for her ties to Putin. And for almost that entire period, the German Defence Secretary was none other than one Ursula von der Leyen, now presiding over the EU. How is it that these hypocrites get away with preaching as though they are holier than thou, while the world's press glosses over their grubby fingerprints on some of the greatest scandals in the past decade? Well, let's speak to former senior military intelligence officer Philip Ingram. Philip, what's your reaction to those revelations? I mean, it beggars belief, frankly, doesn't it?
Well, it does beg a belief. Shocked but not surprised is my reaction. The French in particular, but also German industry isn't as open as many people think. But the French in particular have been known for supplying components for weapons and interpreting the rules the way they want to. And it's something that they've done for many, many years.
Should we be dragging the likes of Macron and von der Leyen over the coals for this and saying, did you have eyes on these deals? Did this pass across your desk? Or should we let bygones be bygone?
Well, I think behind closed doors, the different leaders will be being dragged across the coals. This is fantastic political capital, but it's best used where it's not in the public domain to try and influence decisions so that they go the right way, and to highlight where the EU isn't providing or has never provided oversight for the rules it set itself. The UK has got very, very tight rules and is one of the tightest regimes for arms exports across the globe, including what you talked about, the dual-use weapons or dual-use components.
I mean, the problem here, isn't it, that there are countries in the EU, especially Germany, who have been extremely hesitant about tooling up Ukraine over the past 3 months. We're now entering the third month of that conflict. And when it comes to energy and all sorts, the EU's proximity, or certain countries in the EU, their proximity to the Kremlin has really been uncomfortably exposed. How much is that, and the EU's current bent to have its own defence pact and set up its own army, a threat to organisations such as NATO?
It's not at all. You know, NATO is made up primarily EU members, and then you've got the United States and Canada. It will always be the defensive pact. The EU itself, you know, I've been in many EU defence meetings, and frankly, they're a joke. You know, they can't agree amongst themselves as to the tiniest of little things. There's no way would you ever get the EU agreeing to push and produce a capable military force of going off and doing anything more than a very lightweight policing mission somewhere or a training mission somewhere. They just haven't got the political kudos to be able to do that, because any one member can veto it. And therefore, it will never, ever be a credible military alliance in any way, shape or form. And that's why NATO is secure, because NATO provides not just that security for the United States, Canada and the whole of the North Atlantic, but also for the EU. And there's a lot of countries have been leeching off that with their defence budgets for many years.
I mean, it is worth taking note that Emmanuel Macron's just been re-elected as president of France, and he is one of these people really pushing for PESCO, as it's known, this EU defence treaty, and the EU moving into the field of foreign affairs. Is it not a concern? I mean, first of all, what happens to France's nuclear weapon? Does that become an EU nuclear weapon? Who's got their finger on the button? And is it not a concern if the EU move into this particular area that is really going to bog down decision-making between Western states? And if we're faced with another Ukraine, there's going to be even more heel-dragging than we've seen.
Well, and this is where people forget what defence is about. Your defence is a national capability there to first and foremost protect the country it belongs to. It's not something that you pass in the same way as foreign policy. It's not something that you pass in totality to another organisation. Otherwise, what you're doing is you're creating another state. You're not, and then anything else is subordinate to it. Now, there are certain members of the EU want to do that and have been trying to do that, and that's their aspiration to have this United States of Europe. But again, I don't think any sovereign state will actually properly agree to that. France and Germany keep sparring off each other to try and do this because, you know, originally the EU was put together to try and stop France and Germany going to war again, as they did twice in the 20th century. And there's a lot of political dancing around it, and it's just trying to get that one-upmanship the whole way through. The reality is completely different.
Philip Ingram, it's always fascinating to hear your views on this. That's Philip Ingram, of course, former senior military intelligence officer. Joining me on the show today is Benjamin Loughnane, who's a research fellow at the conservative think tank, the Bow Group. I mean, what do you make of all of this? I've been ranting about this on my show for quite a while. I'm pleased to see it now printed in black and white in a respectable newspaper. But why is it that the world's not up in arms, well, to coin the phrase, up in arms about this, that people aren't saying to Ursula von der Leyen, did you sign off on this?
Well, I think it just goes to show how useless the EU really is. If Britain are doing a better job of keeping to their accords than they are of keeping to their own accords, we're not even part of the EU. It just goes to show that it's not about being part of the EU. It's about your intentions as individuals. Money talks. These people, you know, will outwardly say that they're not going to sell arms to Russia and then do it through back channels because at the end of the day, they follow the money. I think, you know, there's a moral crisis there around the money, and we need to look into it a bit more.
I mean, there's always been this worrying duplicity for Brexiteers like me of the EU not following its own rules and the UK, frankly, following them to the letter of the law on the most part. But it's really exposing who our allies are. I mean, are we in a situation now where we should be looking across the English Channel thinking we can't really trust them?
No. You always get the duplicity. People want to play sort of both sides so that whoever wins, they've got them, you know, sort of on their side. And I think, you know, we are quite well-intentioned in this country. We take moral stands. We never do that sort of thing. And so when we see it happening across the Channel, we do get a bit outraged by it. And that's one of the driving forces behind Brexit, I think, is that we have a very different culture around that sort of thing.
Yeah, I'll tell you what, Benjamin, I'm deeply concerned that the EU PESCO treaty is going to go ahead and quite what that means for British security. Well, we're going to cross to our home and security editor, Mark White, now, who's in south-east London, where 4 people have been found fatally stabbed. Mark, great to have you on the programme. Give us an update on this pretty harrowing story.
Yeah, this is Delaford Road in Bermondsey, the scene of a horrific quadruple stabbing that took place in the early hours of this morning. We just had a briefing from the Metropolitan Police, the local borough commander, who was telling us that the victims were a man and woman in their 60s, another woman in her 40s and a further woman in her 30s. There has been another woman who came here just a short time ago in floods of tears, telling us that her auntie and uncle and cousin lived in that house. She didn't know who the fourth victim was. We know that there is a man in custody at this stage. Police saying not an awful lot more than that. This is what Chief Superintendent Colin Windmore, who is the borough commander here in Bermondsey, said a short time ago.
In the early hours of this morning, following a call from neighbours, officers forced entry into a house here in Delaford Road. Inside the house, they made a dreadful discovery of 4 people who had been stabbed. Despite the best efforts of officers and paramedics, all 4 people were sadly pronounced dead at the scene. I can confirm that the deceased were 3 women, believed to be aged in their mid-60s, 40s and 30s, and 1 man believed to be aged in their mid-60s.
We are now in the protracted stage of this investigation. It is the detectives and the forensic teams who are here in this quiet residential street, gathering as much evidence as they can. Remember, the crime scene itself is fairly confined, but we are talking about 4 victims here, so a lot of forensics that has to be gathered. The man who is in custody, we're told by the police, was known to the victims, but nothing further than that. He is being questioned now at a South London police station.
Mark, thank you ever so much. That's Mark White, our home and security editor. You're with GBNews on TV and radio. After the break, we'll be crossing to Paris to discuss the French elections and what Emmanuel Macron's victory means for the UK. But first, let's have a little look on the weather forecast.
Hello, this is Alex Deakin with your latest weather update from the Met Office. Not much rain around for the rest of this week. Many places seeing sunny spells by day. Temperatures around average during the day, but some cold nights ahead with a touch of frost. High pressure is dominating, keeping things dry, but around the high, the winds are coming down from the north, hence why it is going to be on the cool side, particularly in the east, where we'll have a lot of cloud over the next few days as well. We've seen a few scattered showers today across parts of England, southern Scotland. They're fading away through the evening, most having a dry night. The cloud increasing once more, though, over northeast Scotland. Maybe a few showers here, but generally a dry night with clear skies and light winds and tumbling temperatures down to 3 or 4, even in towns and cities, which means in rural areas we will be close to freezing and a touch below in a few spots. So a chilly start to Tuesday, but generally a dry and a bright day. Certainly sunny spells across Wales, the Midlands, southern England. Clouds spilling in across Scotland, northeast England. Maybe 1 or 2 showers here through the day. Just edging further south as well. Some cloud will develop almost everywhere, but it should generally stay dry and bright across the southwest. 16, maybe 17 Celsius under the cloudy skies. Quite chilly, though, on some of those North Sea coasts, particularly where there's still a bit of a breeze blowing, so that's going to make it feel quite cold here. Any showers will fade away through Tuesday evening, so again, most places dry and clear, and just a hint of blue on the chart, so again, pockets of frost as we head into Wednesday morning. Wednesday also, for the vast majority, dry and bright, not as much cloud around. Although again, of course, eastern England, it could be quite gloomy, and again, that will have quite an impact on the feel of the day without any sunshine, feeling quite chilly, but with some sunnier skies further west, not feeling too bad on Wednesday. High pressure will continue to dominate, but shift, so sitting right over the UK for the rest of this week, keeping things largely dry, but we'll continue to have those chilly nights.
Coming up on Dan Wootton tonight, after Prince Harry sends shockwaves throughout the world by voicing concerns for the Queen, threatening to shatter the royal peace process, the father-in-law he's never met, Thomas Markle, gives his first reaction to the runaway Duke's latest bombshell. Plus, Meghan's dad makes a world-exclusive announcement that will rock the Sussexes and the whole of the UK. The unmissable interview with Thomas Markle, coming up on Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. to 11 p.m. on GB News.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events, and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debate, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
On radio, they call it the drive time slot, 4 p.m. until 6 p.m. as listeners head home. It's that part of the schedule when the dust of the day's events begin to clarify, and we try to make sense of it for you. Brazier is drive time for radio and TV. It's fast, it's punchy, it's opinionated, there's a Brazier angle and a little bit of levity.
That's the question. That's two questions, actually.
That's Brazier, Monday to Thursday, 4 till 6 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Patrick Christie's.
And I'm Mercy Moroki.
Make sure that you join us Monday to Thursday, 10 a.m. until midday, right here on GB News for To The Point.
We're not afraid to talk about the topics that matter to you or the big topics that always matter.
We cover absolutely everything, from the breaking political stories of the day to law and order, what's going on in the channel. We're not afraid to hold people to account.
We always make sure we include your views on our show.
Indeed, if you're thinking it, you can guarantee that we're saying it. So make sure you join the conversation with us, 10 a.m. until midday, Monday to Thursday, for To The Point on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Et voila, another term for French President Emmanuel Macron. Hardly a shock result. But what has raised eyebrows is quite how many French voters either backed Marine Le Pen or didn't bother to vote at all. And the usual suspects are lapping up her defeat, while Macron spins his cheesy lines of unifying France by being a president for all. But when will they learn? Brexit and Trump signified a new era in politics in the West. And it is not, as some organisations would have you believe, the rise of the far right. There is a world of difference between the horrific politics of 20th century monsters wanting to ethnically cleanse their countries and a population rallying against globalisation that has left them poorer, ignored by a wealthy elite, and culturally fragile, with their values and customs being erased at the altar of so-called inclusion, while minority cultures appear to be gifted a carte blanche to reject integration and assimilation. Yet again, the people have pushed for populism, because like it says on the tin, it speaks for them. Yet again, they've been ignored. But the problem with repeatedly demonising and silencing a huge proportion of the population is if you build up so much fury, well, that is when the real monsters get into power. Well, let's now go live to Paris and get more from our political editor, Darren McCaffrey. Darren, not an easy 5 years ahead for Macron, it seems. Do you think he's likely to start pivoting more to Le Pen-style politics?
No, in many ways, I think he's probably going to do the opposite to a large degree, Alex. I mean, Emmanuel Macron has been a pretty centrist politician, clearly, for the last 5 years, but his critics would accuse him, actually, in some ways, of being on the centre-right rather than the centre-left. And I think this next 5 years he's going to try and appeal to Mélenchon's supporters. He's the kind of left-wing candidate who nearly beat Marine Le Pen into the second round, who got over 20% of the vote. The expectation is, and we're going to head into National Assembly elections in just a couple of months' time in June, that we're likely to see a left-leaning Prime Minister appointed if Emmanuel Macron manages to secure a majority in those elections. If we look at the good news for Emmanuel Macron last night, and there is some, it must be said that he did better than the polls had suggested, getting 58% of the vote. All in all, it was still a very comfortable victory for Emmanuel Macron, doing much better than many of his predecessors. He was, of course, the first French president to have been re-elected in 20 years, the first French president since the start of the Fifth Republic to have ended up getting re-elected while his party was also in government. But you're right, there was still difficulties for Emmanuel Macron. Many people who turned out to support him did so to keep Marine Le Pen out, rather because they loved Emmanuel Macron. And also voter turnout was down at its lowest level since 1969. A lot of people simply didn't want to back either candidate, and you got a real sense of that last night. I was right next to the Eiffel Tower behind me where his supporters were gathered, and yes, of course there was joy, there was a lot of relief, it must be said too, but none of the fervour of excitement that we saw 5 years ago.
Does this represent really that France is now becoming very divided? Because the traditional two parties, the equivalent, let's say, of our Conservatives and Labour Party, les Socialistes and les Républicains, both lost out heavily, frankly, on the verge of going bankrupt because they lost deposits.
Yeah, quite incredible indeed. I think between them, in the first round, they managed to get less than 7% of votes. As you say, two of the established parties here in France. Is France divided? You bet it is, and that's what this election campaign has exposed. Divided between essentially people on the far right and the far left who feel very disenfranchised, the extremes, if you like, for equal measure with how France is being run. And we got a reflection of that in the whole range of votes that were received on both those wings during the first round. A division between cities where Emmanuel Macron did very well, like here in Paris, like in Lyon and elsewhere, compared to the rural vote, which again benefited Marine Le Pen. But certainly a sense, as you say, that globalisation isn't working for many French people, that they do not like some of these big reforms that Emmanuel Macron has tried to push through. And I think to a large degree, Alex, those deep divisions, and this is the real challenge for Emmanuel Macron, those deep divisions may well just get worse. And when you reflect on that, because Marine Le Pen, this is her third defeat, yet at every stage she has managed to increase her percentage share of the vote. We got a sense of the flavour of the reaction to what people thought last night when those results were announced. And here's a kind of sample of the mood here in Paris.
It's historic. We never did a score like that. So it's very promising for the future, for the next presidential election. Yes, it's 5 years later, but we are patient.
It was an amazing nightmare because when I heard all the newspaper, all the media, all the supporting people of Macron, if Marine Le Pen will be elected tonight, it will be the end of the world.
You know, I wish things were reversed, and I'm very, very disappointed, of course. But, you know, I kind of expected it because I believe the polls.
I feel sad, obviously, because we lose, of course, but at the same time, I keep hope because our score, is pretty great for us, so it's not too bad.
There you go, that was the sense of the mood at Marine Le Pen's rally last night. In many ways, let's look a little bit wider, Alex, if we do, for 1 minute, and that is, what's this impact going to be on Europe and indeed on the UK? There was an awful lot of relief, it must be said, in European capitals last night. If you look at those images from the Eiffel Tower, not just were Emmanuel Macron supporters waving the French tricolour, but also the EU flag as well. Emmanuel Macron put EU membership and French leadership of the EU at the heart of his campaign, and certainly he will now be the most senior EU figure inside the European Union, someone who wants to see deeper integration, in comparison, of course, to Olaf Scholz, who's just started his term as German Chancellor. Does that make life a bit more difficult for Britain? I think in the end it does. Emmanuel Macron, not a supporter of Brexit, perhaps unsurprisingly, hasn't necessarily, the British government would say, fulfilled his end of the bargain when it came to that migration deal. We're trying to stop channel crossings in small boats. So I think that kind of uneasy relationship, if you like, between Emmanuel Macron and Boris Johnson is likely to continue in the second term, not least of all because, frankly, it must be said for the French here, the focus of Macron's second term will not really involve Britain very much, outside, of course, though, of that key military relationship in NATO, where Macron and Johnson are on the same page when it comes to defiance against Russia and support for Ukraine.
Darren, thank you very much. Great stuff. I'll be sending you my wine shopping list a bit later as well. Darren McCaffrey there, live from Paris. Benjamin Loughnane from the Bow Group think tank. What do you make of this? I mean, the characterisation in the UK media of Le Pen it's reminded me of Brexit all over again. It's been so hyperbolic. And, well, frankly, I don't think this election result's going to mean much of a change at all, really, is it?
No, well, if you look at the polling, which I saw earlier, of Mélenchon voters who switched to Macron, 91% of them said they did so not because they like Macron or think he'd make a good president, but because they wanted to keep Le Pen out. Now, that's reflective of the negative campaign that Macron was running. It was all about Le Pen is awful, not Macron is excellent. Not vote for Macron, it's don't vote for Le Pen. When you run a campaign like that, and when you try to run a country like that, it's unsustainable because people forget about Le Pen. As soon as Macron goes on to be president, all of those grudges get turned back onto Macron. They forget about Le Pen within a couple of weeks, and discontent builds up. And then, as you said, the real monsters come. Le Pen is not a monster, but someone else will galvanise that support, and people will be so desperate to get rid of someone like Macron that you don't know what you're unleashing.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. Benjamin, thank you very much. You're with GBNews on TV and DAB radio. Coming up, we're expecting to hear from the Home Secretary, who's being questioned in the Commons on her plan to send migrants to Rwanda. Now, though, it's time for a check on the GB News headlines.
It's 2:31. Good afternoon. I'm Rosie Wright, here to keep you up to date. Police say 4 victims stabbed to death in south-east London were a man and woman in their 60s, 2 women in their 30s and 40s. They were discovered by officers at a property in Bermondsey in the early hours of this morning. A man in his late 20s has been arrested on suspicion of murder. The niece of one of the victims has paid tribute to her aunt, saying she didn't deserve to die. The press regulator has received 5,500 complaints over an article about the deputy Labour leader. The Mail on Sunday reported claims by an unnamed Conservative MP that Angela Rayner had tried to distract Boris Johnson in the Commons by crossing and uncrossing her legs. Well, Ipsos is looking into possible breaches of the editorial code in the article. Boris Johnson says it's very important to have a French president who can be relied upon over the war in Ukraine. It's after Emmanuel Macron beat his right-wing opponent, Marine Le Pen, in the presidential elections. She's previously held close ties with Vladimir Putin. Prince William has laid a wreath at the cenotaph to remember the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps personnel who were killed during a battle in Gallipoli during the First World War. 130,000 lives were lost. Anzac Day originally commemorated the ill-fated Allied landings, but now honours troops from all conflicts. You're up to date. We're on your TV, online and DAB+ radio. Don't go anywhere. Alex will be back in a moment.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events, and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debates, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
On radio, they call it the drive time slot, 4 p.m. until 6 p.m. as listeners head home. It's that part of the schedule when the dust of the day's events begin to clarify, and we try to make sense of it for you. Brazier is drive time for radio and TV. It's fast, it's punchy, it's opinionated, there's a Brazier angle and a little bit of levity.
That's the question. That's 2 questions, actually.
That's Brazier, Monday to Thursday, 4 till 6 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Patrick Christie's.
And I'm Mercy Moroki.
Make sure that you join us Monday to Thursday, 10 a.m. until midday, right here on GB News for To The Point.
We're not afraid to talk about the topics that matter to you or the big topics that always matter.
We cover absolutely everything, from the breaking political stories of the day to law and order, what's going on in the channel. We're not afraid to hold people to account.
We always make sure we include your views on our show.
Indeed, if you're thinking it, you can guarantee that we're saying it. So make sure you join the conversation with us 10 a.m. until midday, Monday to Thursday for To The Point on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
I called it. Our good old government by soundbite has done it again. I said that the idea to send migrants to Rwanda, love it or loathe it, was a headline generator designed to deflect responsibility from a government who have failed to tackle the channel crossings by pushing blame on everyone else. We can now cross to Priti Patel to see if she can justify the fact that it's been found out that only 2% of migrants would probably be sent to Rwanda each year for processing. Here she is.
Members from across this House have called on the government to make it easier for people from Ukraine to seek sanctuary in the UK. But can the Home Secretary explain why the schemes for those trying to flee the Taliban are so limited and why, according to her own department, the Nationalities and Borders Bill does not establish safe and legal routes for those fleeing war, conflict or persecution?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, in response to the Honourable Lady, first of all, the new plan for immigration spells out absolutely the government's approach to safe and legal routes. And in fact, as I've said many times, Mr. Speaker, in this House, every safe and legal route needs to be bespoke based on the crisis that we are seeking to address. Secondly, in response to Afghanistan, the Honourable Lady will know that under the ACRIS scheme, we will welcome up to 20,000 people at risk who've been affected by the most appalling events in Afghanistan. That was announced last year, including women, girls and members of minority groups given their vulnerability.
We now come to the Shadow Minister, Holly Lynch.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. A family still in Ukraine has been reporting back to their Homes for Ukraine Halifax sponsors that they can hear the bombs getting closer every day of their 29 days and counting wait for a visa. The family in Ukraine has twins under 10 who remarkably have had their visas processed at different speeds. A Home Office whistleblower has described the scheme as designed to fail, with government figures showing that 40,000 visas have indeed been issued under the Homes for Ukraine scheme, yet just 6,600 Ukrainians have actually arrived in the UK because families who need to travel together cannot do so because just one family member, often a child, will have their visas delayed. So can the Home Secretary explain, if 40,000 visas have been issued, why so few have arrived in the UK and what she's doing to correct this?
I actually thank the Honourable Lady for her question because it's an important point that she is making. There are a number of points to make in response to her question. First and foremost, in terms of the reason why why low numbers have come to the UK, as I've already said, over 71,000 visas for both schemes have been granted. And it is a
Priti Patel there, taking questions on the floor of the Commons. We were expecting her to talk about the Rwanda migrant plan, but we can do that instead, can't we, Benjamin? We were talking earlier, weren't we, that, you know, it was a big headline-grabbing policy. It generated outrage from all the right people, but frankly, how many migrants are going to be put on a plane and sent to East Africa? 2%, apparently.
Well, it's amazing how all of these people keep falling for it. When their government come out with this big policy and they say, oh, look at this awful thing we're going to do that you hate us for. And they will go, oh, terrible, the government are doing that. And then abandon the whole Partygate saga. That's exactly what the government's game plan is. If you start talking about this Rwanda plan, everyone will forget about Partygate. Everyone will forget about all of these other scandals. And then in a couple of weeks, it'll blow over anyway, because no one's going to get sent back to Rwanda. Let's face it. The number of legal challenges that are going to people go through to prevent this plan from taking off, the number of people who are actually eligible to be sent there in the first place, it'll be a few people over the course of a couple of years, and it will cost us an enormous amount of money. And all it will really do is save Boris's skin, I think.
But it actually ticks all the right boxes for the government, doesn't it? Because when this plan doesn't go through, we've seen the optics of Priti Patel behind a lectern in Rwanda saying, we are doing this, the government signed a deal. And no doubt they have. And then you've got Denmark as well following hot on our heels. But when it does all go wrong, the government can say, we've done everything. It's not our fault.
Well, exactly. They can say, well, look, we tried, but we couldn't do it because of the lawyers who stopped us, all of those activists, all of those people. It's not our fault. We really did do our best. But really, I don't think they actually care about it. I think they want to be seen to care. I think they want to be seen to be doing something or trying because they know that the electorate care. They know that actual people care about the security of our borders and the integrity of our nation. But they don't really care. They just have to look as though they're trying.
Yeah, it's a bit of a madcap plan, I thought, from the offset. Now, if you haven't set foot in Ukraine as a Western leader since the war broke out, you're dreadfully behind times. Today marks the turn of America, with Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin arriving in the war-torn country on the day Russia's invasion marks its third month. Thankfully, they didn't send Biden. I wouldn't want to see him sleepwalking up the wrong street into a convoy of Russian tanks, mistaking the Z insignia, thinking it stood for Zelensky. And despite Blinken telling media that Russia was failing in its war, that is little succor to the women and children trapped in the steelworks of Mariupol, with no humanitarian corridor established to get them to safety as Putin obliterates the city. And if the tide has turned, all the more reason for the West to up the ante and send whatever it is that Ukraine needs to retake vital territory. Yes, Blinken is right. The assistance of some 30 countries providing Kiev with financial and military aid is having an effect. So it stands to reason that more really does mean more if Ukraine is to win this war. Well, joining us from Odessa in Ukraine is Hannah Shelest, who's the Director of Security Programmes at the Foreign Policy and Security think tank Ukrainian Prism. Hannah, I mean, Antony Blinken visiting Ukraine today, perhaps a key moment, reinforcing America's support. But Zelensky, again, calling for more weapons, more aid financially, more support, NATO to do more. Do you really think that Blinken is right when he says that Russia is failing? Can you see the tide turning?
First of all, about the Russian actions, definitely we understand that they are much more have manpower or ammunition, but at the same time we see that they have much outdated strategy and lower performance on the ground. That's why we already see how they left the northern territories of Ukraine and concentrated their efforts on the east, and at the same time concentrated their efforts at the missile attacks against the civilian infrastructure and residential areas and in Odessa this Saturday, just because they don't want to have the open fight with the Ukrainian forces. When Ukraine is asking for the more ammunition, we need to understand clearly what Ukraine is asking. First of all, because for 2 months we've been fighting, so definitely a lot of this ammunition being already used. And we need the additional supply because nobody been prepared for such a long war. And the second reason is that we see how the Russian tactics changed, including these missiles attacks that are happening, for you to imagine, as far as from the Caspian Sea. That's what happened this weekend, for example. So we need a proper air defense systems that is very complex and difficult equipment that we need more of them to protect the huge territory of Ukraine. Because if originally the shelling's been happening on the north and on the east, now we have them, for example, this morning, 5 different regions, most of them in the western part of the country, being targeted with the heavy missiles, Russians being aiming at the railway infrastructure.
I mean, from what you've said, it seems to me that Russia is doubling down. If anything, it seems like Putin is becoming a cornered rat and lashing out even more. I mean, Ukraine has done an incredible job pushing Russia back. Everyone thought this conflict was going to be over in a matter of days. That hasn't happened. But Ukraine is being torn into pieces in the process. What is it that is needed to stop this? And are words like Blinken saying, oh, Russia's failing just because it's taking longer, are they actually helpful? Or does that risk countries in the West taking their eye off the ball?
The Russia is failing because they are not reaching the original goals. So it's not only military failing. You need to understand that the strategic goals are not reached, because what they wanted Ukraine to be further from the West, further from NATO, from the European Union, and they received completely opposite. They didn't want NATO to enlarge, and now we have Finland and Sweden applying for the NATO membership. So in this case, Russia is definitely failing. And also they are failing in terms of local support. They were sure that Ukrainian population will be happy to see Russian soldiers here, and you see the strong resistance on the roots, on the ground level, all around the country. So in this way, Russians already lost in Ukraine because they didn't get their strategic goals. In terms of tactical, definitely they are destroying the territory of Ukraine. And we see that now it became a goal to definitely to destroy as much as possible of the civilian infrastructure, so the country will not be able to develop as it's been planned previously. How long we will be able to continue with this, that is a difficult question for sure. But at the same time, you need to look, for example, at photos of Bucha, where just a few weeks ago we had completely ruined and destroyed by the Russian forces, raped city, and how quickly volunteers and the local authorities cleaned up. Definitely, there are more to reconstruct the buildings, but already as the spring coming, people would like their life is coming back as well. That's why they're immediately trying to clean up all around after the Russian forces are leaving their towns or the villages. But still, Russians really want some victory by the 9th of May. That's why now we understand that the second round of this operation started. And at least for the next week, we will see more and more of the quite violent attacks from there.
Hannah, thank you for coming on the programme today, and it's always fantastic getting your views direct from Ukraine. That's Hannah Shelest, who's Director of Security Programmes at the Foreign Policy and Security think tank Ukrainian Prism. Benjamin, the Ukrainian valiance is in no doubt. And again, I mean, it's very easy for us, I think, to get complacent. We've moved on to other domestic topics in news headlines. And yet, when you hear people like Blinken saying, Russia's failing, well, the problem is the war's not ending. Is it not time that we say, look, clearly giving them all of these weapons is having an impact. We need to up the ante and do a lot more to really help Ukraine push back Russia once and for all.
Yeah, well, there are two wars happening. There's the actual war physically happening, and then there's the sort of media war, the information war, what's being briefed and what's coming out in the West, and how we react to that. I think one of the problems with over-egging the pudding with regards to how valiantly Ukraine are pushing back against Russia is that people go, oh, well, that's dealt with. We can move on and talk about other things now. I think it needs to be made clear that, that there is still a war, sort of conflict. Ukraine still needs help. It's not all over. And when you some people have, I think, exaggerated how much Ukraine have managed to push back Russia and saying, Putin must be cowering in a corner by now. Well, he is still, a very powerful leader, a very powerful military. And the moment that Western complacency takes over and the support stops, Ukraine are still pushing back. It's David and Goliath at the end of the day.
Benjamin, thank you so much. Now, moving on, I have long said, if anywhere needed a Me Too moment, it's Westminster, or Pestminster, as it is being dubbed, following shocking revelations that more than 50 MPs are facing investigation for sexual harassment, including 3 cabinet and 2 shadow cabinet ministers. The lurid plot line of the Netflix series Anatomy of a Scandal, despite being laden with predictable tropes, is all too believable. Bonking on desks and boorish comments are par for the course when it comes to showbiz for ugly people. And there's something about the aphrodisiac of power that seems to draw young, troubled types into student politics, and then the offices of rotten borough brutes, where they whisper in the ears of salivating lobby hacks who ply their sources with alcohol. It is a recipe for tawdry goings-on, the likes of which don't take place in your average office. Add to that cocaine detected in almost every Parliament's toilet, and you have a recipe for unfettered debauchery. Meanwhile, the culture of politics allows thinly disguised sexism to still litter the columns of tabloids. Whether it's calling the previous PM Mrs. May, something the BBC seemed to insist upon, or making out Angela Rayner's been flashing more than her parliamentary pass, it's all so grubbily 1980s. In Brussels, there's even a hotel opposite the Parliament where rooms are advertised by the hour. It makes you wonder when these people find the time to run countries. Well, let's talk now to Liberal Democrat MP Christine Jardine. Christine, 50 MPs being investigated for sexual harassment. That's eye-watering. That is absolutely eye-watering. Does that surprise you?
To a certain extent, yes, it does. But I think if there are allegations, then they have to be investigated because, I mean, you mentioned the Angela Rayner story, and, you know, every woman in Westminster has a story to tell about misogyny. Actually, just about every woman in politics has a story to tell about misogyny. And sadly, you know, what we're hearing doesn't tell us anything new or anything that some of us haven't already heard about the sort of shocking attitude and views that are around Westminster.
I mean, the culture in UK politics, culture in politics full stop, but the culture in UK politics does seem to me to very often involve a lot of drinking, a lot of scandal, a lot of late nights, a lot of impressionable young assistants who regard politicians a little bit like pop stars. Have you witnessed the sort of things going on that make you deeply concerned about the practices in the Palace of Westminster?
Well, I have to say, I don't think any of my staff regard me as anything approaching a pop star. I haven't personally witnessed anything, but you know, I think we do have a problem in politics with perception of what is going on, and the particular story this week, I think the repercussions must be focused on which Tory MPs are going around saying this sort of thing. That's the root of the story, and it's the Conservative Party which needs to be, you know, properly called out in this, and not some copy and paste statement on the Twitter feeds. We have to investigate what is going on at Parliament and remove the whip from whichever MP or any MPs who are either involved in any sort of misconduct or who have been saying the sort of things that we've seen in the papers this weekend. It's just not good enough. We have to clamp down on it. And you're absolutely, I mean, not long after I was first elected here, which was almost 5 years ago now, we talked about clamping down on the atmosphere and the sexism and the sort of harassment and bullying that went on. And I worry now that we're not making the progress that we thought that we were making, that we wanted to make. And that's not good enough. We have to. But as I say, we need to look at our attitudes. And in society as well, we have to have a better attitude. We have to attack things like domestic violence. And key to that will be making misogyny a hate crime.
I mean, when you look at that Angela Rayner story, it is shocking, but one would think that it's the very first time a woman has been, you know, brought into some sort of misogynistic, nudge, nudge, wink, wink, tittle-tattle in a newspaper ever. It seems to me that when it comes to the way people react to these things, it only really counts as sexism, misogyny when it's being levelled against someone on the left of politics. For instance, the BBC seemed to insist on calling Theresa May Mrs May, like a dinner lady, for most of her tenure. I've suffered hellish amounts of abuse, especially on the nudge, nudge, wink, wink front. There's been all sorts of ways in which newspapers represent women in positions of power. I'm sure people like Gina Miller have gone through it as well. Do you hope that this might mark a watershed moment?
Yeah, I think, I mean, you're absolutely right. We've all suffered from it. And I come from a background in journalism, and as an industry 20, 30 years ago, we had a terrible problem and we clamped down on it. And I think now politics has to do the same. There is a kind of, in some areas still a kind of pat her on the head, you know, and call her Mrs May, kind of unhealthy attitude to women. Now, in my party, we've gone a long way towards tackling this. We've worked very hard on it. We've still got work to do, but we've now gone from the position where, after the 2015 election, we had an all-male line-up in Parliament to having a majority female line-up in Parliament, and that does make a difference. The more women you have involved in politics, the more they call this sort of behaviour out, this sort of anti-feminine, misogynistic behaviour, the more they call it out and the more you get to do about it. So I think the more women we have in politics, the better that it will become. And I think you've seen this weekend women on all sides of politics. Caroline Noakes from the Conservative Party, we've seen Labour Party members, we've seen everybody calling it out. And that's because there are now more women in Parliament. I mean, we all recently on International Women's Day were given our number, the number, the sort of where we came in the number of women who were elected, and I'm number 465. But that was in 2017. Now, that's not good enough. We need more women in politics. We need more women in Parliament, and then we will address it. And we'll call this out, this behaviour out, and this state of mind, this sort of attitude, which seems to still tell some men that it's acceptable to say this sort of thing. And, you know, unacceptable behaviour is unacceptable behaviour, whoever it comes from, whatever the gender is.
Christine Jardine, thank you so much for coming on. Keep fighting the good fight. I back you all the way. Now, you know the old adage, new week, new woke. Well, you don't, because I just invented it. But like the past 50-odd weeks we've been on air, the predictable slurry of skin-crawling imbecility is evidenced in every newspaper in the land, and I've skimmed the lot of them to deliver you full-fat fury at the modern world. It's time for my agenda. So Google has created a new inclusive language function, and I, for one, can't wait. Not because I wish to join the brigade of linguaphobes who find gendered terminology terrifying. Oh no, I'm learning Italian, where every word is male or female. Although you may be relieved to know, inglese, or the word for English, is reassuringly gender neutral. Phew. No, because I think it will be as much fun as reading BBC Pidgin. Oh yes, we all get our knickers in a twist at the mindless censorship and erasure of our language, but perhaps it's time we sit back and enjoyed it. First up in the Google Inclusivator has to be that 90s classic by Shania Twain, Man, I Feel Like a Woman, or perhaps Michael Jackson, because it really does matter if you're black or white. The highway code has been updated to include a 5-point penalty for car drivers who get too close to cyclists. Apparently, we've got to leave at least 1.5 meters of space, or basically plough into oncoming traffic, so Jeremy, with his trouser clips, weaves around Ubers with his panniers full of chia seed. But what if the pandemic spawned pelotons of man-boobed midlife crisis Tour de France wannabes in grotesque lycra get too close to us? Are we supposed to be repelled by some invisible force field? Wasn't there recently an argument that cyclists in packs should go single file? It will all end like a road version of The Floor is on Fire and become something akin to a highway in Bangalore, which will be made all the more entertaining by tossing the odd elephant into the mix. That's all we've got time for. I want to thank Benjamin Loughnane for joining me today from the Conservative think tank Bow Group. He will be back at some point in the future. I will be back in the very near future, 2 o'clock tomorrow, same time, same place. That's all I have time for today, though. Bye-bye.
Hello, this is Alex Deakin with your latest weather update from the Met Office. Not much rain around for the rest of this week. Many places seeing sunny spells by day. Temperatures around average during the day, but some cold nights ahead with a touch of frost. High pressure is dominating, keeping things dry, but around the high, the winds are coming down from the north, hence why it is going to be on the cool side, particularly in the east, where we'll have a lot of cloud over the next few days as well. We've seen a few scattered showers today across parts of England, southern Scotland. They're fading away through the evening, most having a dry night. The cloud increasing once more, though, over northeast Scotland. Maybe a few showers here, but generally a dry night with clear skies and light winds and tumbling temperatures down to 3 or 4, even in towns and cities, which means in rural areas we will be close to freezing and a touch below in a few spots. So a chilly start to Tuesday, but generally a dry and a bright day. Certainly sunny spells across Wales, the Midlands, southern England. Clouds spilling in across Scotland, northeast England. Maybe 1 or 2 showers here through the day. Just edging further south as well. Some cloud will develop almost everywhere, but it should generally stay dry and bright across the southwest. 16, maybe 17 Celsius under the cloudy skies. Quite chilly, though, on some of those North Sea coasts, particularly where there's still a bit of a breeze blowing, so that's going to make it feel quite cold here. Any showers will fade away through Tuesday evening, so again, most places dry and clear, and just a hint of blue on the chart, so again, pockets of frost as we head into Wednesday morning. Wednesday also, for the vast majority, dry and bright, not as much cloud around. Although, again, of course, eastern England, it could be quite gloomy. And, again, that will have quite an impact on the feel of the day without any sunshine, feeling quite chilly, but with some